Today we are going to look at a particular passage of Scripture. If you have your Bible, if you don't, it's fine, but if you have one, we'll be in Matthew 24. In actually just a few weeks, we'll be in the same parallel passage in Mark. But this is the Olivet Discourse, Jesus' discourse on the Mount of Olives. About 2 days before he's arrested and tried, it's right here at the very end of his ministry. He gives this, we say another Sermon on the Mount. So the first of Matthew, he gives a Sermon on the Mount. At the end of Matthew, he gives another Sermon on the Mount. But it is known as the Olivet Discourse because it's on the Mount of Olives. It's Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. So what is the context of this Olivet Discourse? Before we start in Matthew 24, we actually need to look in Matthew, actually even a little bit earlier than this, but Matthew 21. We'll begin to set the stage to see where we're going and how we end up here. So in Matthew 21, this is actually where we'll be in Mark in a couple of weeks with a triumphant entry where Jesus now makes it to Jerusalem. He's on his way. We're going to look at today's sermon. He's still on his way to Jerusalem. He'll be there next in 2 weeks. But he's on his way there, and here is a triumphal entry in Matthew 21. He comes into Jerusalem, and the people are laying the palm branches down. It's Palm Sunday, and he comes into Jerusalem. This is a week before Passover. He comes in. He makes his way to the temple, sees the temple being abused in that the priests were just making money off of sacrifices and such. And this is where Jesus says, "You've turned my Father's house into a den of thieves." And he just, throws the tables over and makes a whip out of some cords and chases people out of his Father's house for their corruption. On the way out, the next stage that we see, he curses a fig tree. It seems like a very petty thing if you're just thinking about it, but he's actually facing, if you could picture it this way, he's facing the fig tree that is facing the temple. Even if that's not the direction he's looking, that's the picture he gives, because he curses the fig tree because he comes to it and he doesn't find any fruit. What's happening is Jesus has come to his temple, right? He's come to his Father's house and he's not found any fruit. He came incarnate as, the incarnate Son of God, and lived 33 years and saw no fruit that should be displayed from his people. So he curses the fig tree, and in doing so, symbolically curses the temple that is standing right there in front of him. The next thing we see in 3 phases through Mark is where his authority is challenged. First by the chief priests and the elders in chapter 21. Then we see the parable of the 2 sons and the parable of the tenants. So the parable of the 2 sons is where we're in Matthew 21, making our way to Matthew 24. So Matthew 21, you have the parable of the 2 sons. Jesus says, the guy's got 2 sons. He tells them both to go do something. And one says, "I'm going to go do it," and then doesn't do it. And the other says, "I'm not going to do it," and then does. Which one obeyed, right? That's Jesus' point. It's the one who said they wouldn't at first, but eventually did. They eventually obeyed. So he's challenged by the chief priests and elders, the parable of the 2 sons. Then there's the parable of the tenants. This is where Jesus gives the parable of the man who had the vineyard, and he had some hired workers to work in the vineyard. And every time the owner, who was far away, would send a representative, they would beat him, kill him, do whatever they're doing to him. And he finally says, "You know what? I'm going to send my son. They'll honor and respect my son." So he sends the son, and they see the son and say, "This is the heir. Let's kill him, and we'll just take the vineyard for ourselves." You see, Jesus is, even in telling these parables, he's leading up to something, because that's literally what Israel has done for hundreds of years. Every time a prophet is sent to them, they kill the prophet. They stone the prophet. History says Isaiah was actually cut in half. He was persecuted. The prophets were persecuted and rejected. And so the picture is the Father says, "I know, I'll send my son." Now, God knows everything. It's not like he doesn't know what's going to happen. And then here comes the son. They kill him, right? That's the parable that is being told. Matthew 22 is the parable of the wedding feast, where the guy has a wedding feast prepared and none of the invited guests are coming. And he says, we've got to have people. You go out everywhere you can and find people, whoever you can find. And the whole wedding hall is full. The Jews are not coming to Christ, right? The Jews are rejecting him. The picture is it's going out to the Gentiles. Back to that previous parable about the tenants. Jesus ends that parable by saying, what do you suppose is going to happen when the vineyard owner shows up? And they were like, well, he's going to do away with those wicked tenants. He said, yep. And that's the picture. He said, the kingdom of God is being taken from you and given to those who's going to bear fruit. The fig tree wasn't bearing fruit. The kingdom of God was taken away from God's old covenant people and given to the Gentiles. That's the picture. That's what was about to take place. So after the parable of the wedding feast, we have the Pharisees try to entangle Jesus by asking him about taxes, specifically the temple tax. So that's the Pharisees challenging him. Then we have the Sadducees challenge him about the resurrection. And then there was a lawyer who asked him about the great commandment. And verse 46 in chapter 22 is a pivotal verse. In verse 46, we have, and no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. After that pivotal point when Jesus has been basically grilled by the Pharisees, the lawyers, the scribes, the Sadducees, and everyone's grilled him, and none of them been able to defeat him or find fault in him. He turns the tables now. In verse 23, then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So now he's turning around and bringing an indictment on the scribes and Pharisees who've been trying to find fault in him. He turns it around to them. And here in chapter 23, we have what are known as the 7 woes. Jesus pronounces 7 woes over Jerusalem. He says in chapter 23, first he says, woe to you, hypocrites, you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. The next one, he calls them hypocrites, right? You make proselytes who are twice as much a child of hell as you are. He says, you travel land and sea to make a convert to Judaism, and you make them twice the son of hell as you are. So he's turning around, he's talking to the scribes and Pharisees and about the scribes and Pharisees. Next, he says, blind guides, woe to you, blind guides, you swear by the temple. Next, hypocrites, you tithe mint. So they're tithing little bitty seeds. They're making sure to give a tithe of every little bitty thing they have, but they've neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. He calls them hypocrites. You clean the outside, but in the inside, you're full of greed and self-indulgence. Hypocrites, you are like whitewashed tombs, right? A beautiful tomb on the outside, full of dead men's bones. And then he says, next he says, hypocrites, you build the tombs of the prophets, witnessing against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. He said, you go to the tombs of the prophets and you make sure they look nice and beautiful and they're well taken care of. But you are descendants of the very ones who killed the prophets. So he's calling them hypocrites for this. And who is Jesus addressing here? He says, you scribes and Pharisees. You scribes and Pharisees. Trying to see what order I want to go in here, because we're fixing to go into Matthew 24. For the sake of setting the stage, I want to look at a couple other passages through Matthew. Matthew 11 through 16. Jesus says, truly, I say to you, among those born of woman, there is no one greater than John the Baptist. Yet the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. But to what shall I compare this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplace and calling to their playmates. And then he continues. Real quick, to what can I compare this generation? What generation is Jesus talking about? The generation that has something to do with John the Baptist, right? The generation, what does this generation mean? It means this generation. What does this church mean? It means this church, right? And so, just for context, Jesus is making a comparison to the generation that he's in. What shall compare this generation? Not 2,000 years in the future generation, right? This generation. Matthew 12, 38 through 42. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, saying, Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you. But he answered, An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign. But no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was in the belly of the whale, the Son of Man will be 3 days in the heart of the earth. Verse 42, the queen of the south will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. So Jesus is pronouncing a condemnation and a truth claim about the guilt of that generation, the one that he was in. Matthew 23, where we just were, verses 34 through 36. Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. What generation is he talking about? The one that he's in, right? From Abel to Zechariah, Jesus is standing there and says, will come upon this generation. We can clearly understand, surely he's not talking about a future generation 5,000 years in the future or in the past or anything, right? This generation means this generation. At the end of Matthew 23, we have Jesus' lament over Jerusalem, where he says, Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets, what it is known for, right? And stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. He pronounces desolation, pronounces judgment over their house, which was the temple, right? An interesting thing to note, I think the comparison here with these 7 woes is really pivotal. In Leviticus, we won't turn to them and read them all. We could, but 4 times in Leviticus 26, you have God talking about, if you disobey me, here's what's going to happen. If you continue to disobey me, here's what's going to continue to happen. And every time he says, I'm going to punish you 7 times more. 7 times more, 7 times more, 7 times more. In Matthew 23, we have 7 woes pronounced against Jerusalem. I think it's pivotal that we don't have 4 woes or 8 woes or 9 or 13 or something, right? Because Jerusalem is guilty of violating those parameters, those covenant guidelines that were warned about in Leviticus 26. It's what they were doing. Matthew 24. So here's this context again. We've led all the way up here. Matthew 23, the end, we have the lament over Jerusalem. Here's a key verse I want to look at before we even look at Matthew 24. Before we look at the first in Matthew 24. It's Matthew 24, verse 34. In Matthew 24, 34, we have these words, and someone can tell me what they mean. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. What generation is he talking about? Pop quiz. If he's not, we have no biblical warrant to believe it, right? I mean, I'm sorry, excuse me. Every other use of generation in Matthew, it's the guilt against them, the woes against them, right? So that's what he says in 24, verse 34. But what's he say leading up to that? Opening 24, Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Real quick, this was in the very early 30s, maybe it's either 30 or 33 AD. The case seems stronger for for 30, but it's really hard to pin it down. The temple that they're talking about that costed billions of dollars to construct and was still not yet fully complete, have been being built for about 50 years, I think, at this time, but billions of dollars of our currency estimation into it. Jesus said there's not going to be one stone left upon another. This was the year 30, and the year 70 is when Rome sacks Jerusalem, takes over Jerusalem, and literally piece by piece dismantles the temple. There is zero evidence the temple ever stood in Jerusalem. There's no temple, there's no shred of the Ark of the Covenant, there's no shred of a piece of gold or anything, because of what Jesus said here in Matthew 24, the prophecy. Verse 3, as he said on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" It's key here, the word age. Some Bibles might say world, but it's not the word cosmos, which is typically world. It's aion, which is like eon, right? Which is age. And so it's a period of time, not the globe floating in space, right? It's a period of time, the end of this age. Jesus answered them. Now remember what we saw in verse 34 that gives context to the timing of these things, right? Jesus says all of these things will take place before the end of that generation. See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, "I am the Christ." And they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these things are but the beginning of birth pains. What does basically everyone do when they read this? They look around and they say, there's a war right now in Iran, right? There's wars over here going on. There's famines right now. When that earthquake hit last year, we were in Tennessee, and it was not far from us, the epicenter, and it was a big earthquake. I go on Facebook, and what do all my dispensational friends have on Facebook? You know, there's a sign of the end of the age, you know. That type of earthquake happens multiple times a day all over the planet. The planet's huge. Earthquakes happen all the time, right? But if you happen to live in East Tennessee and there's an earthquake, that's a sign of what Jesus is talking about here. That's kind of far-fetched to me, right? So, what do we have? We have Jesus gives this discourse just before Passover in either 30 or 33 AD. Rome surrounds Jerusalem just before the Passover in 70. A biblical generation is 40 years, right? The generation of unbelievers died in the wilderness after 40 years. There's a strong argument that the understanding of a biblical generation is 40 years. If Jesus says this generation will not pass away until all these things be fulfilled, and he's talking about the destruction of the temple and the doing away with the old covenant and all the rituals, the sacrifices, and all of those things, and judgment upon God's covenant-breaking people, and he gives the prophecy just before Passover in AD 30, take a guess when you think Rome surrounded Jerusalem ready to attack in the year 70. When do you think it might have been? Right before Passover. Literally right before Passover. And so you're talking about either 40 years to the dot or 37 years to the dot. Either way, it's right within that 40-year time frame. Now we have the time constraint, so we can walk through this discourse. Not one stone left upon another. The signs of the end of the age. He says, watch out for false Christs. Real quick, today, are there people who say, you know, they're Christ? I mean, we hear that stuff. It happens, right? There was, because of this messianic expectation in this time, there were a lot of false Christs and false prophets in that very time, which from just before the time of Jesus, in that 40-year window. There was a man named Thaddeus who's mentioned in Acts 5. There's the Egyptian prophet mentioned in Acts 21. They each gathered thousands of people. Thaddeus prophesied and declared that he could part the Jordan River. So making these miraculous claims and then gathering all these followers. There are tons of sign prophets. Josephus repeatedly mentions prophetic agitators who are promising divine intervention. What this looked like is in Jeremiah's day, just before the destruction of that temple. In Jeremiah's day, he was prophesying, look, we're going into Babylonian captivity. We can't avoid it because of all of our disobediences, and we're breaking God's law. We're going into captivity. But these word of faith prophets are standing up saying, no, God's on our side. We've got the temple. We're not going into captivity. When they do go into captivity, Jeremiah says, we're staying 70 years. They say, no, God's going to deliver us. We're going to be out any minute now, right? That's the same thing here. Jesus and the apostles who believe Jesus understand that the temple is coming to nothing, right? The temple is about to be destroyed. But these Jewish prophets are saying, no, we've got the temple. We've got the sacrifices. God's not going to abandon us, even though they just killed God's son, right? God's not going to abandon us. We rejected the Messiah. We've killed all the prophets, but he's not going to abandon us. So you had tons of these prophetic agitators. You have a guy named Menahem in AD 66, another guy named Simon in 69 and 70. You have a guy named John, who was a revolutionary leader. All of these are in that generational period, right? Wars and rumors of wars. Here's something very important to know. If you've been in school, I mean, me, it was a long, long time ago, but you may have heard of the Pax Romana, called the Peace of Rome. It was from about BC 27 until about 180 AD. It was an enforced peace, but the Roman Empire owned the world, right? The whole known world. And if you paid your tribute to Rome, you know, it was a time of peace. Now, there were like some border, skirmishes, and there were little revolutionary uprisings here and there. But for the most part, the time of peace. Jesus was born during the Pax Romana, a time of peace. It was an enforced peace, like you might get crucified, but if you submit to Rome, right? If you're at peace with Rome, you're set. But after the crucifixion of Christ, and you have Nero, who was the emperor in the 50s and into the 60s, who was a psychopath, an absolute psychopath. During his tumultuous, never say that word right, messed up reign, rule as an emperor, you had uprisings and you had a time of actually civil war in the Roman Empire that happened after Nero killed himself in 64. Killed himself in 64, I think it was. That next year, you had 4 emperors in 1 year because they were being assassinated, dying, or whatever. And then with that last one, it kind of brought a little bit of stability back to the Roman Empire. But the wars and rumors of wars, he's not talking about U.S. and Iran. He's talking about, if we understand the context, Jesus said, you're going to hear wars and rumors of wars, and the apostles look at each other and say, man, we've not heard of any wars in a long time. We've not really heard any rumors in a long time. But, you actually have the Jewish revolt where you had like Simon the Zealot, who was one of the apostles. Before he became an apostle, he was a zealot, which is a political activist who carried a dagger, right, to fight. And you had a lot of assassinations by the zealots of Roman guards and centurions in Jerusalem. It was an uprising. And so here you have Jerusalem rising up against the Roman Empire. That's a rumor of a war. It actually leads into the Jewish war that was from 66 to 73. Literally a war that those apostles had never seen, right? In any type of setting like that. And so you had, I have a whole list. If you want the list, I'll give you a list of a bunch of the skirmishes that happened and wars that took place. Those 4 emperors were Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and then Vespasian. Vespasian was the emperor when Rome sacked Jerusalem under General Titus. So Vespasian was the emperor and Titus was the general. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. Famines and earthquakes. He says this is just the beginning of sorrows. Guys, the Bible is very intentional. There's a prophet in the book of Acts named Agabus. Luke records 2 of his prophecies. One of them is about the Apostle Paul going to be captured in Jerusalem. The other one was a prophecy that there would be a famine in the whole world. Why in the world does Luke record this in the book of Acts? What's the purpose of it? Sure, it shows that the Christians pulled together to send relief to Jerusalem because of the famine, but you don't have to include that. But there's a global famine that takes place during the reign of Emperor Claudius from 41 to 54. He was emperor from 41 to 54. And this global, Roman Empire global, right? Famine took place then. Tacitus, a historian, records grain shortages and famine conditions in Rome. Suetonius, another historian, describes repeated food crises under Claudius. Josephus, who wrote near 90 or 100 AD, describes a severe famine in Judea around 46 to 48. Earthquakes, right? In Acts chapter 16, there's an earthquake that where the Paul and Silas are let out of the Philippian jail. And honestly, if you search, there's not like the most accurate historical accounts of earthquakes, right? In that time, but you do have a cluster of recorded earthquakes in that time, and before, the 100 years before and 100 years after, just 2 or 3 that are recorded, but a ton recorded in those 40 years. There was, of course, an earthquake in Laodicea that just about flattened Laodicea in 60 or 61, an earthquake in Pompeii in 62, Crete in 46, Rome in 51, Apamea in 53, Campania in 63, just all over the known world, the Roman Empire. And after this time, they're not recorded. If there are, they're just not really recorded until we start, we got seismographs that records every one of them now, right? False prophets, again, numerous prophets arose during this time. And verse 14 is pivotal as well. In verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. That sounds like that's not happened yet. But what does Jesus say in verse 34? All these things must take place in this generation. Again, the word here for world, the whole world, is not cosmos. It's a completely different word. It is oikumene. Oikumene refers to the inhabited world. For instance, when Caesar Augustus declared that the whole world should be taxed, there's a census of the whole world. Did Caesar send delegates to North America and take a census of the Native Americans living here? No, he didn't. Just the Roman Empire, but it was the whole world, right? It was the oikumene, the entire world would be taxed. In the next section, starting verse 15, we have the words about the abomination of desolation. And we're going to circle back to that in the coming weeks because we're not going to spend time right there, mainly because we can't even get started because it's 10:43. I'm trying to find a good stopping point here, though. But what we do see is in this passage that those in Judea, we read they flee to the mountains, and there's a warning not to go back on your housetop. In first century Jerusalem, half of your day was spent on the roof of the house. Like you had stairs outside, you're on the roof. That's where you did your trade work or you hung out. You slept a lot of times on the roof. I have never been on my roof. It's not something we do. So this prophetic word probably can't apply to us, right? We don't live that way. And we know the time constraints put on this prophecy in verse 24. So those in Judea flee to the mountains. You shouldn't go back on your rooftop. He also says, pray that your flight not be in winter or on a Sabbath. If this applies to us, how would we do this? How would we do this if this applies to us? First of all, we don't go back on our rooftops, right? Second of all, I guess we flee to what's the closest mountain here? We just go to that mountain? How does this apply to us? Jesus was speaking to that specific audience where he was in that moment. And we will stop right there because the next passage we're going to pick up here in verse 29 speaks of the coming of the Son of Man. We're going to pick up here in verse 29 next week. Then we got the lesson of the fig tree right after that. But remember, verse 34 gives us a time constraint here. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So that's the time marker that we're looking at, that generation. So there we go. Any questions? Not you guys, because you got a ton. Yeah. If you don't have, yeah, you absolutely, yeah, you're welcome. What was that first thing you said, right? You know.
So the word used for like world being the inhabited area, like in the Bible, does use those other words for world. It's like, oh my gosh, we can't all learn Greek and Aramaic and Hebrew, but like,
I think I can answer. I think I know your question. So sometimes there's aeon. We just looked earlier. Aeon, that means it's translated world sometimes, but it should be age. Cosmos or oikumene. It's not. None of these things are definitive in themselves. So the fact that oikumene is used here does not necessarily mean it always means the exact same thing in the exact same context. Think of the English language, right? We, you know, I'm burning up right now. You guys aren't calling 911 because I'm dying, right? It's the way we use language. We understand language. So it's a lot more than just the word. It's the word in context, and you add all the evidences, right? You look at all the stuff. So that's why oikumene, I don't think it can, in this sense, mean the entire world, or else, when Caesar taxed the whole world, he taxed the Native Americans, right? It's the inhabited world, the oikumene, the Roman Empire. So, yeah, I thought it might be. So there's never, it's very, very dangerous for a first or second year Greek student to start doing Greek word studies. It's kind of dangerous sometimes. So not everything is as cut in stone as we'd like it to be. I'm burning up, right?